All right, welcome folks. Thanks everyone for joining. My name is Andy Cohen. I'm a pre-sales engineer here at Citrix. I'm responsible for many of our enterprise accounts at New England. One of those accounts is Liberty Mutual, so I'm pleased today to introduce Tony Lyons. Tony is the Chief Citrix Architect at Liberty Mutual. He's responsible for most of their design and architecture for their Citrix environment, as well as many other things. So when Tony came to me and said, hey, I want to do a Synergy presentation, I'm thinking about doing it on our journey to Citrix Cloud, I thought it was a fantastic idea. I said, let's go for it. You know, what do you need from us to help? It's a great story. A lot of my customers ask about how do I get there with my enterprise environment? I have some uniqueness, I have some customization. How do I get to this new cloud model? So I thought it would resonate really well with the rest of our customers, and I'm really happy he was able to come here today. Hopefully you learned something today that will help with your own journey. So with that, I'll give it to Tony and you can take it away.
Thanks a lot. My name is Anthony Lyons. I'm a technologist at Liberty Mutual Insurance. I'm an IT professional with about 37 years experience in IT. So like most people with a long history in IT, I've had an opportunity to work in a few different IT disciplines. I was a programmer, network engineer, systems administrator, a few different things, but I had the good fortune about 18 years ago to get an opportunity to go to work at Liberty Mutual Insurance. Now, one of the first things that I was asked very early after I took on my role at Liberty Mutual Insurance is, you think you could get this application to run on this new platform called MetaFrame XP? Any of you that have been around for a while know that that's one of the first farm-based XenApp environments. To make a long story short, obviously that went pretty well because for the last 18 years I've been doing design and architecture for XenApp and XenDesktop solutions at Liberty Mutual, and as well as a lot of automation with PowerShell, finding ways to automate things that we do with Citrix at Liberty Mutual. My current focus has been primarily around taking XenApp, XenDesktop, getting them to work in AWS, get them to work in Azure, as well as we did a POC with Citrix Cloud. In the POC we did with Citrix Cloud a couple of years ago, and now we are actively migrating to Citrix Cloud. In this presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that we've done in our migrations to Citrix Cloud, some of the utilities that we've built that if we couldn't make those move to Citrix Cloud along with our brokering infrastructure, then moving to Citrix Cloud simply wouldn't be possible for us. So what do we want to get from Citrix Cloud? Liberty Mutual obviously would like to get to a single point of administration. We've got roughly about 20 XenApp and XenDesktop infrastructures at Liberty Mutual that are managed individually. Now I could do an entire PowerPoint presentation on how did we get to a point where we have so many different Citrix infrastructures, a large number of different resource locations, acquisitions, and a variety of different reasons. And I also am not completely oblivious to the fact that single point of administration or single pane of glass is sort of like the unicorn of the IT industry. Everybody hears about it, but nobody ever sees it. But the reality is that right now with 20 separate Citrix infrastructures that we have to manage, and now the fact that Liberty Mutual has been moving for the last 2 or 3 years very heavily towards public cloud infrastructures. We've been moving some of our back-end applications to public cloud, AWS, and in Azure. What we have found is that if we didn't find a new way, we were going to continue to proliferate legacy Citrix environments throughout our environment. Right now, just this year alone, we would probably move from 20 separate Citrix environments to about 25 separate Citrix environments if we didn't find a new way of doing things. So the other thing we want to do is we want to get away from network boundaries. With moving to public cloud, we're going to have instances where we're going to need to host XenApp servers, VDI infrastructures, where we may not want connectivity back to on-premise. We don't want to have a scenario in which where network boundaries become an issue. With Citrix Cloud, now all we need is connectivity back for our cloud connectors back into Citrix Cloud, and we can use that single pane of glass to manage them, whether they're in Azure, AWS, various different regions around the world, or on-prem. Another thing that we want to do, we want to make sure that our key technologies investments could go unchanged. We can move to Citrix Cloud, and we can continue to use our Storefront. We can continue to use our NetScalers. We continue to use our Radius for two-factor authentication for our brokering of our connections. And we can use our same VDAs. If we go with any other technology other than Citrix Cloud, we're going to have to reinvest in all of that. And with a large Citrix infrastructure, that is an awful lot of work to have to recreate the wheel. So how did we get to this point? Liberty Mutual said, we started taking serious interest in Citrix Cloud back in early 2017. We said, well, let's do a POC with it. Now, I'm not saying that Citrix Cloud is fully baked even today, but 2 years ago, it was even far less baked than it is today. And so what we said is, you know what, because public cloud is part of the reason that we're so interested in Citrix Cloud, we said, well, let's go ahead and do a POC. And we're going to do that POC in Azure. We're going to throw 50 developers out there in Azure, and we're going to stand up some cloud connectors, and we're going to stand up some NetScalers and some VDAs and our own separate storefront environment so we can isolate them. And we're going to use Azure AD for the authentication. We didn't identify any serious challenges that we didn't think could be overcome, either by us or by Citrix. Because we partnered with Citrix and Microsoft on this endeavor, we wanted to do this POC. We hadn't done any Citrix in public cloud 2 years ago. We hadn't done Citrix Cloud 2 years ago. So Microsoft and Citrix came together to help us get that POC off the ground and get it tested. We did find some things, lessons learned during that POC, such as some simple things like cloud connectors can't authenticate between Active Directory Forest without placing cloud connectors in both Forest. DDCs can, as long as there's a two-way trust between the environments. We found out that there were some things like power state and registration were much longer 2 years ago in Citrix Cloud than they are on the legacy product on-prem. But these were things that Citrix promised that they could solve those things for us. Also things like administrative logging didn't exist back then in Citrix Cloud, and things like license usage monitoring didn't exist in Citrix Cloud back then. But again, these were things that partnering with Citrix, they promised those were things that were coming soon. So we decided after that that we were going to give it a little more time, but we started talking more seriously about moving to Citrix Cloud as some of these things materialized.
I'll add that, as Tony kind of alluded, that early on we had the opportunity to get Tony and his team engaged with a lot of our product managers and even our consulting group. So as he was exploring Citrix Cloud and bringing up these challenges, we were able to get that right into our product team to create enhancements. You'll hear a lot of that throughout this presentation because our folks really appreciated that Tony came right out front with, hey, here's the things that a large, complex enterprise account needs in Citrix Cloud that's not there yet. And you'll see a lot of those things have been added or will be added shortly.
Yeah, and a few of those things, they actually, during our 4 to 6 month period that we were doing this POC, they actually fixed some of the things that we brought to their attention during that period for us. So let's say you're like Liberty Mutual and you've decided that you want to move to Citrix Cloud. You've got some architectural decisions to make. And some of them seem relatively simplistic, but some of them really have a significant impact. How are you going to secure your control plane access? The control plane is the keys to the kingdom. That's how you define access. You define who's going to get access to a VDI machine or a published application. Obviously, our security department was very interested in how are we going to secure the access to that control plane since that's outside of our data center now. Are you going to migrate everything? Are you going to, instead of migrating everything, are you going to migrate some things? Are you going to start provisioning new but let your old stuff die off organically that's brokered on premise? Liberty Mutual, we decided that we are going to go all in. We're going to move everything to Citrix Cloud. Now, in our migration process, we've learned a few things. So we decided, okay, well, we're going to migrate almost everything. And then we decided, well, we're going to migrate almost everything still, but it might not be exactly the same path we thought when we first started. But that's because we learned some things along the way. Going to continue to use your storefront, or are you going to use Citrix hosted workspace? Liberty Mutual, we decided we're going to stick with storefront for now, but we do see a future where we could be using workspace in the future, especially with some things as it continues to develop. Now, are you going to use your old NetScaler architecture, or are you going to use NetScalers as a service? Well, obviously, NetScalers as a service is really only an option if you go to workspace. We're not there yet, but again, we see some opportunities to use NetScalers as a service, possibly in like some of our public cloud options and things of that nature once we do get to workspace. The last two items were huge for Liberty Mutual. Existing automation and custom services you might have built around your Citrix environments. Do you need access to the performance databases of your Citrix sites? Today, Liberty Mutual, we've written a lot of orchestration and a lot of automation, especially around our XenDesktop space. And we heavily use the data in the performance data databases of our XenDesktop environments. Loss of access to that performance data database could be a showstopper for us moving to Citrix Cloud because we would lose some utilities that we've written. And I'm going to talk about some of those here in just a few minutes. Well, the first thing our security department wanted to do, we went through a 90-day evaluation with our security department. And one of the things that they were most interested in is how are we going to control that access to the control plane. Well, we did it with Azure AD. Most people in here probably already know you can integrate your control plane with Azure AD. Liberty Mutual already had an Azure AD implementation, and that gave us control over password length, change frequency, complexity requirements, as well as gave us control over, allowed us to implement 2FA and things of that nature for access to our control plane. Now, we did identify something that we kind of glossed over a little bit before we started getting into implementation, and that is, when it comes to your control plane, you can only add users individually. In the legacy Citrix, you can add an AD group for, say, a help desk group. Well, if you take your help desk group, you put them all in an AD group, you grant them access through Storefront, through Studio. Now, anytime they want to add and remove help desk people, it's just an ID services function. Your Citrix folks don't have to worry about that. In Citrix Cloud, you do have to administer adding and removing people and granting them the type of permissions you want on a one-on-one basis. That is one of 3 enhancement requests that we've submitted to Citrix as a part of our migration to Citrix Cloud that they've taken. It's not a showstopper for us. We're moving to it, still moving to Citrix Cloud, but it is something that is an annoyance that now the Citrix team or some administrator from ID services now has to add these people and remove these people from Citrix Cloud, from the control plane. Next thing we wanted to talk about is there's 3 services I talked about. We've got lots of orchestration we've built around our legacy Citrix environments, but we've built 3 orchestrations that are very important to the company. Things that we would not move to Citrix Cloud if we couldn't reconfigure these separate services to work with Citrix Cloud. One of those is our self-service portal. We're using a couple of tools, VRava and Vero, and now also CloudVault. We've created some self-service provisioning that now users can go in, they log into the portal, they simply select from a long list, depending on who they are and what permissions they've got, they get a list of catalogs that they can select to provision the machine. Now, let's say, for argument's sake, they take the second one there, that when they open it up, it's going to say, okay, this is how many CPUs, this is how much memory it gives you, what data center it's going to put you in, what applications might come with this particular build. The user simply clicks on submit, or they modify some of those settings, and they can go get a cup of coffee, they change some other work that they needed to do, and about an hour later, they get an email that says your machine's ready and this is how you can access it. They also can do day 2 operations within this portal. They go into that portal, they can say, I want to increase the amount of memory, I want to reduce the amount of memory. They can say, I want to change the friendly name that my machine is seen in Storefront. They do things of that nature, or they can actually do self-reclamation of these devices. Well, with the ability to do that in that portal, and we build somewhere in the range of about 8,000 to 10,000 machines a year between that and the machines that are getting reclaimed, that's huge. That's something that no administrator gets involved. The self-service portal, it just auto-provisions because of the way we've set it up. Now, if we had to get manually involved in that, that would be a real problem for us. We don't use MCS or PVS because MCS and PVS, well, they're great tools for provisioning machines. We wanted to do a whole lot of other things with that orchestration, adding machines to databases and adding them to HR for chargeback and a lot of different other things that we do with those machines besides just standing up a machine. Now, we did encounter some problems. When we were setting this up and migrating to our own provisioning to Citrix Cloud, we encountered a unique issue. Now, this is just a quick example of a legacy deployment of Citrix. Each site is really pretty much self-contained. Most people, when they provision their Citrix environments, within a physical data center, you'll have your site database, you have your DDCs, you have VDI targets, and when you provision a new VDI machine, That new VDI machine is added to Active Directory, it gets added to Active Directory, then our orchestration comes along, it hits with a remote RM connection to one of those DDCs in that data center, and it says, okay, now I'm going to do a new broker machine, it's going to add it to a machine catalog, and it goes through all the orchestration of adding it to delivery groups, and adding the user, and adding friendly names, and things of that nature. And that all works just fine in a legacy environment. Now, fast forward. We've started migrating our delivery groups to Citrix Cloud. It looks pretty similar. All of your VDI machines, your cloud connectors, and all of that are still there, just like your DDCs were. But the one thing is the database now got extracted out of your data center. Well, what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is now what happens is now you're using a PowerShell server. I go ahead, my provisioning goes out, it does the same thing it always did with Vero. It adds the machine, it adds it to Active Directory. After it adds it to Active Directory, it goes to the PowerShell server and it does that new broker machine to add it to a machine catalog in Citrix Cloud. Where the rub came in for us, and we spent a month working with the Citrix Cloud folks on the development of this. It was that when you go to add that machine to the machine catalog, if you do that right after adding it, let's say I provision a machine in Data Center 1. After I provision that machine in Data Center 1, I immediately try to do a new broker machine. In the legacy model, the DDC is talking to the same AD controllers as the machine that the VDI registered with in that same space. But now, Citrix Cloud, when it goes to do that new broker machine, it doesn't know which data center the machine is in. All it knows is you're going to provision a new machine into Citrix Cloud. It knows the name of the machine, it knows what Active Directory it's in, but it doesn't know what data center, it doesn't know which resource location that it might happen to be in. If your AD doesn't replicate relatively quickly between these data centers, what can happen, and this is what was happening to us for a good period of time, is that you would build the machine in Data Center 1, you do the new broker machine, Citrix Cloud would say, okay, I've got to look up these three pieces of information. I need to look up the SAM name, the SID name, and the DNS name, and it has to happen at the cloud connector. And because it doesn't know which data center, it might use the cloud connector in Data Center 4 or Data Center 3 instead of Data Center 1. If your AD hasn't replicated those identities and the DNS, and if your cloud connectors are using different DNS servers than cloud connectors in Data Center 1, or their VDIs in Data Center 1, you could run into a scenario where, like we were running into, Citrix Cloud, instead of getting a SAM name in the machine catalog, you got a SID, because it couldn't resolve that DNS name. Now, our AD replicates pretty quick. It didn't require much of a delay, but we had to put some orchestration changes so that there's a slight delay between when we bring the machine into Active Directory and then when we tried to do adding the machine to the machine catalog in Citrix Cloud, because of this change in the way of the fact that Citrix Cloud could do the lookup on a cloud connector that's in the wrong data center. Again, we do have a change request in on this one. Because when you do the new broker machine command, you are passing the hypervisor UID. So the breadcrumbs are there that the command could do the lookup and say, okay, well, it's on this on this host connection UID. If it's on that, I know it's in this zone. If it's in this zone, it's in this resource location. Therefore, I know which cloud connectors I should be doing that AD lookup on so that it happens in the same data center. The breadcrumbs are there, and we do have again, like I said, we got a change request into Citrix to see if they can change the functionality of that. The second of the utilities that we couldn't migrate to Citrix Cloud unless we could solve making sure that it worked when we moved to Citrix Cloud is we built our own custom reclamation services. Now, I obviously didn't do this alone. I did this in conjunction with some other really intelligent guys that work on the orchestration side. But we wrote some custom PowerShell that goes out and it hits all of our VDI environments and it pulls in all the metadata necessary to make decisions on reclamation. Then it also goes out and talks to the performance databases of all those VDI environments. It combines the data that it gets back from both of those, it chews on it a little bit, and it decides if those VDI machines should be a target for reclamation. Again, this is a fully automated reclamation service so that our admins don't have to get involved in chasing users down to get them to reclaim their machines. But what it does is, when the machines hit 30 days of not being used, the reclamation service says, you haven't used this machine in 30 days. It sends an email to the user and says, just letting you know you haven't used this machine in 30 days. If you don't need it, reclaim it or Someday we might have to take it from you. It hits 45 days. When it hits 45 days, it sends them another gentle reminder. You still haven't used this machine. If you don't start using it pretty soon, we might have to take it away. If the users don't respond to those first two, when it hits 60 days of non-use, our reclamation service automatically goes out, it reclaims the machine, deletes it from Citrix, removes it from all the other internal systems that we track those machines in, and it sends the user a nice friendly email that says, we've reclaimed your machine. If you need another machine, this is how you can request another machine. Obviously, what this process has done is it has reclaimed 20,000 machines in 2 years. If you just assume a $300 a year run rate for your VDI, that has saved Liberty Mutual $5 million plus in 2 years in run rate. We can't move to Citrix Cloud and lose a utility that can save us $5 million in run rate. So we have one other utility. Now, like I said, we've got a lot more than 3 utilities that we've written that are custom in-house, but the other one was power management. Now, a lot of people in this room is going to look at me kind of funny and say, but Tony, they've got cloud power management built right into the product. Why are you writing your own power management? Well, the reason we had to create our own power management because about 35 to 40% of our VDI machines are developers. Developers are really interesting creatures. That they can come up with interesting ways to use your VDI machines that you would never believe they're going to do. And they found ways in which they could use our VDI machines that the Citrix Power Management didn't recognize, and because it didn't recognize, Power Management would turn their machines off while they were actually still in use. So because we have such a large contingency of developers doing that, I ended up having to write our own custom power management. Now, the reclamation service and this power management service both have one thing in common that made it a real challenge for us to move to Citrix Cloud. And that is, both of these services are reliant on the performance data database of all of the Citrix VDI environments inside of our environment. Moving to Citrix Cloud, that performance database moves to the cloud with your management plane. So what I had to do is I had to come up with a way. I was very fortunate that Citrix does provide us with APIs that allow us to get at that performance data. So what I did is I said, that's great. What I'll do is I'll create a job. I created a database inside of our environment. And then I wrote a job that runs every night, goes out via OData and API calls using REST APIs, and it goes out to Citrix Cloud in our account, and it pulls down the performance data into those tables. Now that I'm pulling that data into our environment, I now have a database again that I can use for reclamation and power management. Now all I got to do is modify my power management, modify the reclamation service to take into account this new database that has the data. And most of that data is fairly closely formatted to the same way it was in the performance database, just a few columns change names. So now I can fix this. The other thing you got to do with all your PowerShell, if you've got a lot of automation like we do, the other thing you got to do is you got to make sure that you understand that when you start doing your PowerShell commands, instead of being in your legacy environment, you can't just run it under a service account that has all the permissions like you do. Now you got to be able to do things like authenticate using keys and secret keys, and using on the fly being able to grab bearer tokens and things of that nature and use them. So your PowerShell skills have to be increased a little bit. And I promise this isn't this is not the SDK session that happened yesterday. But I do talk an awful lot about PowerShell. Okay, so I've talked enough about what would have kept us from being able to migrate to Citrix Cloud. Let's start talking about what are we going to migrate, and then I'll get into exactly how did we start migrating our existing work to Citrix Cloud. Like I said, we're all in. So we modify it. We've already started modifying all of our provisioning and all of our catalogs to be able to provision to Citrix Cloud. We're already provisioning 250 or so machines every day in Citrix Cloud now as a result of changing a lot of our catalogs. Right now we have somewhere in the range of about 24,000 VDAs in the XenDesktop space between our UK operation, our US operation that we're migrating to Citrix Cloud. 4 legacy data centers, and we've got 2 in Azure, and I told you that we started off thinking we were migrating everything directly to Citrix Cloud. Well, we changed our approach a little bit. We decided, you know what, everything in Windows 10, our VDAs are up to date, we're doing a good job of managing our VDA versions and things of that nature in Windows 10. So we said, you know what, we're going to migrate our Windows 10 delivery groups, not only the provisioning of new ones, but we're going to migrate our existing delivery groups over to Citrix Cloud. Windows 7, not so much. We got into the Windows 7 stuff and we realized that we hadn't done as good a job of keeping VDAs up to date as we would like to. And we decided, you know what, it was actually kind of challenging to upgrade some of the older VDAs to current. If it was 7.9 or newer, it wasn't too big of a deal, but if it was older than 7.9, the upgrade process kind of fell down a fair amount, more than we would like. So what we decided is Liberty Mutual had a program in place in order to migrate all of our users from Windows 7 to Windows 10. Said, well, perfect. If we're going to migrate all of our catalogs for provisioning new machines to Citrix Cloud, all we've got to do is give our users a good, healthy nudge to get off of Windows 7. When they provision a new machine, they're going to provision the new machine using Citrix Cloud instead of the legacy brokering environment. So Windows 10, yes, all new provisions going to Citrix Cloud. Windows 10 legacy, yes, we're migrating those to Citrix Cloud. Windows 7, we're hoping to not have to migrate any of our Windows 7 delivery groups over to Citrix Cloud as much as we want to be able to get those users to re-provision. When it comes to our XenApp environments, we've got about 350 XenApp servers in the US and UK that we're migrating to Citrix Cloud. Our XenApp migrations is a little more of a manual process. I'm going to talk about our XenDesktop process in a little bit, in which I've generated a lot of automation for that process. Our XenApp migration is a little more of a conventional migration, such as you would if you were migrating to an on-prem solution. We've built all of our applications out in our XenApp environment so that it's N+1. So it'll be move a XenApp server into Citrix Cloud, republish all the applications. Then once they've been tested by the users, you move the rest of the servers over. Our Storefront sees both environments. So it's going to be more of a conventional type of a process. I'm going to talk about our international operation, which has about 140 XenApp servers later in the slide deck. And the reason I want to talk about that later is because that's part of our public cloud work that we're doing. We've got quite a few projects that are in public cloud. They affect our migration to Citrix Cloud. In fact, all of our stuff that's going into public cloud is going to Citrix Cloud. So I'll talk about that a little bit later in a slide deck.
I'd like to note there that when we first started talking about this project, it was a single use case, 500 users. And as Liberty started going through the evaluation, it grew to, I think, 12 or 13,000 users. And then eventually, by the time they actually decided to use Citrix Cloud, it was their whole virtual environment. So
yeah, it was a fairly long process. And by the end of the process, a lot of things had changed, even in that time frame, in an 8-9 month discussion. A lot had changed in Citrix Cloud by the time we got to the end of those discussions. Okay, the process we actually are using to migrate our existing delivery groups for VDI to Citrix Cloud. The first thing I did is I created a SQL database. In that SQL database, contains all the fields I need to capture all of the metadata I need from all my XenApp and my XenDesktop environments. So now I've got a PowerShell script that runs every morning in the wee hours in the morning while we're all sleeping, and it pulls in the metadata from all of my Citrix environments, XenApp and XenDesktop, and all of our primary locations into a single location. And I ended up finding that I could use that data for a lot of things besides just the actual migration process. Now I can use that data for things along the lines of Power BI. I ended up writing a little more than half a dozen Power BI reports. Those Power BI reports now use that metadata that's pulled in every morning fresh to allow me to evaluate if all the delivery groups and which delivery groups are ready to migrate to Citrix Cloud based on, say, VDA versions and things of that nature. A couple clicks, I immediately know if a delivery group is ready to move to Citrix Cloud or not. Email notifications, also part of your process. You're going to have to be able to notify all of your users that you're going to be migrating them and that you're going to be rebooting their machines as a part of that process. Again, that metadata gives me a place to query in order to find all of the VDI machines that are a part of a migration, who they belong to, and then do an email or do a lookup in Active Directory to get their email address and send them a custom email. The other thing that you use the metadata database for is actual recreation of the VDAs in Citrix Cloud. Because we move all of our catalogs for provisioning new machines to Citrix Cloud first before we start migrating those catalogs, that means that data becomes static. So now that I'm collecting those VDAs into that, I don't have to wait for queries and PowerShell commands in order for me to migrate machines to Citrix Cloud. And you'll see some of the utilities that I wrote here in a minute that use that metadata database. And the other thing that I use it for is rollback. If I migrate some machines out to Citrix Cloud, I need to be able to roll them back. Okay, so emailing the users. About a week before we migrated delivery group to Citrix Cloud, We email the users and we let them know that we are going to be migrating their machines out to Citrix Cloud, and that all they're going to have to do is allow us to reboot their machines that night. And after that reboot, they'll still log into the same storefront URL that they did before, but they need to not be running any applications which might result in them having data loss. Well, how do we do that? I wrote a PowerShell script. Again, you're going to hear me say that a few times here in the next few minutes. That PowerShell script, first thing it does, it prompts you for what data center are you moving a delivery group to Citrix Cloud. It goes out to the metadata database and tells me what are all the delivery groups that are in that metadata. I select the data center or the delivery group that I'm going to migrate out to Citrix Cloud. After I do that, the third prompt is just asking me what date. Now, I don't have to know what machines I'm migrating to Citrix Cloud. I don't have to know who the users are. I don't have to know any of this. Any administrator that is going to do this migration for us, all they got to know is they run this utility and they answer those 3 questions. What does it do? I've got a custom HTML email that it sends, and what it does is it inserts the user's name. I told you it does a lookup against Active Directory, and it gets the user's email address. It also has the user's machine name. It has any friendly name they may have assigned to it. It gives them this nice, what appears to be a lovingly handcrafted email for them, but it actually is a form email that just simply inserts a few tags. Now they get the instructions they need to know when we're doing it, what machine of theirs that we're going to impact, and it also gives them an idea that they need to stay out of their machine that night. But it also lets them know that it should have no impact on them. The following day after the migration, they should be able to access everything the way they always did. Then we get to the migration utility. This is a second PowerShell utility. Now, I had originally thought about doing this utility and the next one exactly at the same time and doing all the steps in one. But what we found is the migration of the VDIs and recreation of the VDIs in Citrix Cloud using automation actually takes longer than you might think. Citrix hasn't provided the SDKs yet, the APIs yet. They're working on them. They have a site out there that talks about the various different APIs. But right now, to recreate all of those VDAs out in Citrix Cloud, you have to use the PowerShell SDK. And you can't do it as one command. You've got many commands that have to be ran. So the PowerShell that I wrote, I decided, you know what? I was getting an average rate of about 10 machines per minute getting recreated in Citrix Cloud. Many of our delivery groups are 3, 4, and some of them even 5,000 users in size. It's like you're talking hours and hours and hours of the recreation. So what I do is that this utility is what I use for recreating the identities out in Citrix Cloud. It allows you to select the data center. It'll give you a custom list of delivery groups. You select the delivery group, and then you select the target delivery group in Citrix Cloud, and then you click Add, and you click OK. It'll add all those machines. You can do this during the production day. It has no effect on your users because they're still brokering using the legacy infrastructure. You also have the ability to roll back. I've got the remove button there that you can select as a remove, and it'll remove them from the delivery groups in Citrix Cloud. The other thing I did is that I wanted to be able to clean up some of the sins of the past. And to be able to clean up some of the sins of the past, we may, in some cases, we have delivery groups that, why did we divide this into 3 delivery groups? It should have been 1 when we created it in the legacy environment. Well, what we do is we give ourselves the ability to clean that up, because now after I migrate the first machine in the left, the first delivery group in the left, all the VDAs into the delivery group in Citrix Cloud, I give myself the ability to now I can select another delivery group on the left and migrate them into Citrix Cloud. And I can even do a third or a fourth if I want to. So now I can consolidate VDAs that used to be in separate delivery groups and machine catalogs into one set of machine catalog and delivery group in Citrix Cloud. So we get to clean up some of the things that maybe we shouldn't have done in the past.
I'll just add here that prior to migration, we again had the opportunity to engage Tony with some of the folks at Citrix that were familiar with migrations and scripting and the back end of Citrix Cloud. So they took a look at his plan and talked about how he's doing things. He got to ask some questions. And actually, when he began the actual migration, he did run into some challenges. But because we had done that pre-work and got those folks familiar with the plan, we were able to work through them pretty quickly.
Yeah. And it was very beneficial to bring those resources to bear. And that's one thing that going to Citrix Cloud, they did assign a team that works with us. So having that team available to answer questions quickly, instead of spending days trying to get an answer, we can usually get an answer within a day to a question. And that's very beneficial. Next step that you have to do, this is when we actually make the users start using Citrix Cloud. I told you I can replicate the identities of all their VDI machines into Citrix Cloud, but they're not using those identities. We leave that delivery group disabled, so they don't see that from our storefront. Now comes the night I want these users to start using Citrix Cloud. Well, what I've done is I've got another PowerShell script that I run that adds these machines to an Active Directory group, which applies a new GPO that changes the list of DDCs. That new list of DDCs tells the machine, okay, quit registering with your DDCs, and you're now going to register with the cloud connectors on your next reboot. So what do I do? It's a PowerShell script. You either click, you're going to add or remove. If you're adding, you're moving forward. If you say, I've migrated some users and they're having some problems, I want to roll it back to on-prem legacy, you would click remove. You then select the data center you're migrating the VDI machines out of, from as far as to Citrix Cloud. The third one, you select the delivery group that you want to migrate to Citrix Cloud. And the third one, all you do is you tell it the AD group that's going to apply that list of DDCs using the group policy. Once you click OK at this screen right here, all the machines will be added to that AD group. Now, the thing that this gets me is by not doing this as part of the previous script, is instead of having to sit around and wait 3 or 4 or 5 hours for a really large delivery group to get recreated in Citrix Cloud, all of that's already done. That's behind me on migration night. The commands it takes to add these machines to an Active Directory group to apply the list of DDCs, that happens very quickly. I can do 3,000 machines in a few minutes, as opposed to waiting hours for the IDs of these machines to get replicated on migration night. What's the target? The target for Liberty Mutual is to get to a hybrid architecture with our Citrix environments. What we want is to be able to manage these devices in a single control plane. Right now, I can, through IIS magic, I can make a machine show up from many different Citrix environments for our users using Storefront. Using IIS magic, I can use the help desk use Director to manage multiple different Citrix sites at the same time. But when it comes to managing the environment using Studio, you still have to log into each of those 20 separate Citrix environments to manage them. What I want to do is change it from having 20 separate Citrix environments to having one production, one test environment, and only have resource locations. Now, if I stand up another resource location, I'm not creating a whole new site database, new Citrix policies, I'm not having to stand up new DDCs and all of that. I add in a couple of cloud connectors, I create a new resource location, all the policies are already created from the existing infrastructure. You might have to tweak it with another policy or two depending on your use case, but now your users are using the environment and you're managing their infrastructure.
This is a popular use case and a driver for people to go to Citrix Cloud where you have that single control plane and resources in different places in the world. And a typical concern is, well, I have some resources, maybe they might be in Asia Pacific or in Europe, and well, this cloud control plane might be in the United States. What's the issue? You know, does that work? And in Liberty's case, that was a concern. So we actually did a follow-on proof of concept where Tony was able to use a US-based virtual apps and desktop service control plane and a resource location in Singapore just to prove out that there wasn't any latency around login times and things like that. So.
And that's true. And I've actually, the next couple slides, I'm going to talk about some of our public cloud initiatives that we've got going on at Liberty Mutual. And one of them talks very specifically to that task. The whole reason we did that POC is one of the implementations that we are currently doing right now in AWS, where we're building machines in Singapore, in AWS in Singapore. We're doing AWS in Europe, and we're doing AWS here in the United States for some of our international folks. And I'll talk about that here in just a second. So what are some of the public cloud projects that we've got going on right now at Liberty Mutual? Well, one of them is a disaster recovery. We want to be able to burst 2,500 machines in Azure, and we want to be able to do it in just a few hours. So we've got a couple of really critical use case users that we want to be able to make sure that, even though we split them across data centers and all of those wonderful things, if we lost a data center, can we get the half of those users that we lost back really quickly? So what we're wanting to do is be able to burst to the cloud in Azure. Instead of standing up 2,500 users worth of capacity in our data center that we then can't use unless there's a disaster, it made sense to use Azure for that. And we've already built all of the automation and orchestration to make all that work. We've built and destroyed over 1,000 machines in Azure using this process. The only thing we're still doing at this point in time for that project is we're continuing to tweak the process so that we can get that number of machines that we can do in a short period of time up. But the basic process is already built and in place and fairly well tested. Next thing that we've got in Azure is we've got a bunch of developers and data scientists right now that I mentioned to you earlier in our POC. Well, our Azure-based developers were part of our POC when we were standing up our environment for the POC environment. Well, they obviously now are very interested in getting themselves added to the whole Citrix Cloud migration. And they've been using a different brokering mechanism, not Citrix at all, in order to get into their devices in Azure. And they're very eager to get into it. We've already stood up their resource location. We've stood up their cloud connectors. At this point in time, the only thing we have left to do for them is get the VDAs installed so that we can start brokering their connections for those users. So very close to completing that work for them. Now, when it comes to, this is probably one of the more, even though I've talked mostly about our VDI migration, and I told you that our XenApp migration was a relatively simple migration. We're doing it sort of the old feet on the ground way. When it comes to our international organization, we're doing something completely different. And what we're doing is, when it comes to our international organization for our XenApp migration, is they have decided to migrate most of their applications out of their data centers, and their 3 data centers, to AWS. So they're moving most of their back-end applications. Now, because they're moving most of their back-end applications, and we front-end a lot of those applications on XenApp in those data centers for their users, that means our XenApp environment has to go as well. Now, we've already stood up XenApp environments in Singapore, in the APC Southeast. We've stood up XenApp environments in the EU, and we've stood up in US East for our Latin America folks. We have environments up in all 3 of those regions right now. We have applications already running production for our users in those locations. We haven't gotten to the full 140 XenApp servers across those 3 locations, but I think we're at like 60, so we probably got about half built out there, and the applications are either being used for production or in user acceptance testing or that kind, and those various realms of work. The neat thing about this is the Citrix team got to learn a whole lot of new tools. They got to learn things like Bitbucket. How do you use Git to put CloudFormation templates and things in and out of Bitbucket? How do you use CloudFormation templates to deploy a machine at all? How do you create a CloudFormation template for deploying servers? And things like how do you use Jenkins as a pipeline for deploying those CloudFormation templates so that you end up with a working server. So the Citrix team had to learn a lot of new skills. For the most part, it was a very good experience for all of them. The other thing that is really good about this is that now we have a sort of a model by which to continue moving other environments out into AWS as more back-end applications move. Next time it might not be international, it might be some of our domestic applications. A lot of domestic applications at Liberty Mutual are being reworked to work in the public cloud. And in that particular case, we need to make sure that we're able to build out our XenApp environments. Another thing, I know I'm running out of time here, but another thing I wanted to mention as it relates to our public cloud, we're also got a POC that's getting ready to start here pretty shortly with VMC in AWS. Probably kicking off, I see Dave shaking his head, it's probably going to kick off within the next week or 2. We're going to start building out the environment. In fact, we've already ordered the virtual servers out there. The enticing thing, and I even heard a presentation earlier about it, the really enticing thing for us about that is now we could build workloads out in AWS, and if we need to, we can then pull those things on-prem. So if we need to burst to the cloud, as long as I write some custom PowerShell that then allows me to move it from those workloads to another vCenter, and then realign all of the necessary pointers in the database so that you can still find the VDI device. We can now build workloads out there in literally in exactly the same format that they're going to run on ESX in our data center, and then pull them into the data center and run a PowerShell script that realigns them to the appropriate vCenter and move the machines. That way we can burst out to VMC, get the capacity, then build the capacity in the data center that we want because it's cheaper there, and then move the devices. So we're going to start working on that pattern over the next few days. Just to touch on a few things real quickly that we learned as a wrap-up for me. We learned with Storefront, not everything's exactly the same. Even though you've got DDCs and you've got cloud connectors, a lot of people try to use those 2 terms interchangeably. They're not exactly the same. They don't function exactly the same. We found that you have to use resource locations if you're going to have multiple resource locations in the same Active Directory infrastructure, and you're going to front end all of those resource locations with the same Storefront site, you need to use aggregation. That's something that you normally only use in Storefront if you've got a DR environment publishing exactly the same icons. In this case, you need to use it for that. Same thing goes with Storefront configuration for Citrix Cloud does not support XML-based authentication. You can't pass the authentication off to your DDCs like you can with a DDC. Cloud connectors don't support that. So if you have a untrusted Active Directory, you're not going to be able to do that. And I'm going to save the rest of the items on this slide. These are things that we talked about throughout the presentation. I just wanted to, as a follow-up here, but I'm going to hand it over to Andy.
Great, yeah, thank you. So I'll just add that Tony discussed a lot of the challenges that he went through over the last couple of years and things that he needed from Citrix. And we actually, as he alluded to, we actually have a team that when you become a cloud customer of Citrix, they get engaged as part of our customer success team. So a lot of the challenges he was able to get through, those folks were responsible for driving that within Citrix to the success of Liberty Mutual. So thank you, Tony. Thanks for everybody for joining. I certainly learned a lot over the last couple of years working with Tony. I hope that you folks learned a lot, and this will help with your own cloud journey. Please take some time to fill out the conference surveys within the app. You can rate the session directly. This presentation, as well as the rest of them, will be available either on the website or via the Synergy website shortly. So thank you very much, folks.